Okay. Okay, let's see. It works. Excellent. So we'll continue now. And our next speaker is Will Storrar. He is the director for the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton. And he has been dabbing in interdisciplinary for a very long time, in interdisciplinarity for a very long time. I hope you're going to tell us about the NASA story and what you're doing there.
Touch on that.
Okay. And so we should have a lot to learn from his own experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. As I walked through your beautiful campus for the first time this afternoon, seeing all these beautiful buildings, I developed building envy. We do have a few nice buildings in Princeton, but as an academic administrator, I saw all these beautiful buildings for the sciences and the humanities with their names carved in stone, and I felt rather homeless as an administrator. And then I did pass, is it the Parkhurst building? With administration carved into stone. It may not be the most popular building on campus, but it's the place from where I stand and where I'm going to give a talk this afternoon. I would like to reflect on how we institute interdisciplinarity. In a sense, how we administer it and foster this wonderful new initiative of cross-disciplinary engagement administratively. How do we do it in practice? Some years ago, I was driving late in the evening in the Highlands of Scotland, my native country. I'd just given a lecture at a conference and had the car radio on for company on the long drive home. Suddenly, I braked and pulled over to the side of the road. It was not a deer in my headlights that had caused me the abrupt stop. No, I felt compelled to write down something I had just heard on the radio program that I was listening to. It seized my imagination. It has inspired me ever since. On the edge of those Scottish mountains, harboring some of the oldest rock formations on the planet, in the darkness of that rural night, unpolluted by the artificial light of our now urban species, with the starry vastness of the universe around me, I first heard this remark by Gadamer, the philosopher, reverberating across the airwaves to the mountain vastness. Gadamer said, "We must make a neighborhood between physics and poetry." I am neither a scientist nor a poet, but rather a general practitioner of cross-disciplinary collaboration, having directed 2 interdisciplinary research centres over the past 16 years. One at my own University of Edinburgh in Scotland, in my field of theology and public issues, working mainly with social scientists, and now, as Marcelo said, in Princeton, New Jersey, as director of the Center of Theological Inquiry, an independent research institute with an international visiting scholar program. With the help of the NASA Astrobiology program and the John Templeton Foundation, we are currently convening researchers in the natural sciences and humanities on the societal implications of astrobiology, the study of the origins, evolution, distribution, and future of life both on this planet and in the cosmos. Out of the practical experience of fostering such collaboration, allow me to reflect with you a little on what makes for a good neighborhood between the sciences and humanities. I have the privilege of living in one such neighborhood, quite literally. At the foot of my street in Princeton is the very modest house where Einstein lived. And near the top of my street lies the grander villa, which was the home in exile of Thomas Mann. Here they are in conversation together in Princeton in 1938, creating their own neighborhood between science and literature. They're both legendary still in Princeton. Einstein will walk around the neighborhood and sit down on the stoop with anyone and make conversation. Thomas Mann appeared out of his grand villa with his little dog, took it for a walk, and went back home, speaking to no one. But making neighborhoods between the arts and sciences is not the prerogative of dead white males or even living ones. The work of fiction that most famously created such a neighborhood of the imagination between physics and poetry is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. The literary scholar Sharon Ruston has shown how the novel was influenced by Shelley's scientific education as a young girl and woman, and her living interest in contemporary investigations into resuscitation, galvanism, as in this illustration, and the possibility of states between life and death. States of injustice have also warped the neighborhoods of the sciences and humanities and made them places of exclusion for talented people who have been subjected to discrimination. The story of the pioneering scientific achievements of the brilliant mathematician Katherine Johnson and her African-American women colleagues at NASA is only now becoming known in the wider culture through books and film, calling for the recovery of such hidden figures in the humanities as well. Inspired by their example from Mary Shelley to Katherine Johnson, that is what we are doing in this conference, making a more welcoming and inclusive neighborhood across our disciplinary borders. Under the visionary leadership of Marcelo Gleiser, the sciences and humanities are becoming better neighbors through this remarkable institute for cross-disciplinary engagement, surrounded as you are here in Dartmouth as well as in Scotland by your own ancient mountains in lightning darkness and starry heavens. But how can we all make such neighborhoods, not only here in Dartmouth, but right across the academy? How do we institute interdisciplinarity between the sciences and humanities in practical terms? How do we overcome the polarity of these two cultures, as famously or perhaps infamously described by C.P. Snow in his 1959 Reed Lecture in Cambridge? While many of the arguments in Snow's lecture have not stood the test of time or scrutiny, not least because he ignored the culture of the emerging social sciences, Snow was surely right to identify the danger of mutual isolation in the academy. As the sociologist Robert Bellah said at a symposium my center held in 2012 on his magnum opus, Religion in Human Evolution, the academy is divided into a whole series of iron cages. It's bad enough to have disciplinary boundaries, but to have sub-disciplinary boundaries, all that needs to be smashed through, said Bellah. That is the cultural challenge I wish to reflect on briefly now. How do we smash through the iron cages that entrap us in our own disciplinary specializations and create instead an open and inclusive neighborhood between physics and poetry? We find an important clue in the work of one of the great humanist scholars of our time, the historian Fritz Stern. A former provost of Columbia University, Stern died in May. His memorial service is being held in the University Chapel in New York this afternoon as we meet, in fearful symmetry with this conference and launch of this center. Earlier this year, Stern published a new edition of his collection of essays entitled Einstein's German World. Several of the chapters in that volume are on German scientists who were contemporaries of Einstein in the years before he came to the States. Among them is Max Planck. Describing the physicist's approach to scientific inquiry, Stern writes in this collection, Planck's own life made him aware of the close relationship between science and the arts. Scientific ideas, he said, originate in delicate psychological processes within the scientist's mind and world of thought, largely on the level of the unconscious. These, said Planck, are divine mysteries. Stern, the historian, admired Planck as a fellow humanist as well as a great scientist. He wrote, "To read Planck is a singular pleasure. The style of thought and expression, the sober tone of restrained passion testify to his affinity with the classics," for Goethe. Here is the clue as to how we make a neighborhood between physics and poetry, through the affinities between scientists and humanists. Not just the spontaneous liking or sympathy between them, but the discovery of similarities of thought that invite a relationship across the borders of these two modes of human inquiry. The discovery of shared human experience of transcendence in the testing of hypotheses and the interpreting of texts. This affinity between the scientist and the artist, which Fritz Stern saw in Max Planck, was never more beautifully described than in a conversation between our own Marcelo Gleiser and the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and teacher of creative writing, Marlon Robinson, recorded here by the broadcaster Krista Tippett for her public radio show as part of the program of that same symposium where we honored the work of Bob Bella. Let's listen in on them discussing this affinity. In her interview with the physicist and the novelist, Tippett remarked, "It occurred to me when I was reading both of you and thinking about this conversation, how much a novelist and a scientist, a physicist, have in common as creators and discoverers." To which Marlon replied with characteristic laughter in her voice, "I'm flattered." Marcelo Gleiser responded, "So am I. I mean, novelists create universes, right? Talk about a multiverse. You know, the mind of a novelist is a huge multiverse because they are creating all of these different dynamics and people that don't exist." Marlon, yes, there's the problem of plausibility, making what even appears to be a sort of working model of a human personality such a delicate thing. Marcelo, for sure. Yes, how is it that you say fiction is, it's telling lies, but wanting to make sure they sound like true? We try to do something similar. We try to make models which are never the whole truth of nature. That is a fundamental point. Every model is a lie, but some models explain more than others. Marlon, I tell my students, actually, that the mind continuously creates hypotheses. Tomorrow is a hypothesis. You have some theory of the general shape of tomorrow, which could be completely false, completely inaccurate. But you have to have the hypothesis in order to be sane and act rationally in the world. And when you're writing fiction, she said, you're doing something of the same kind. Or when you're making a scientific theory, you're doing something of the same kind. This is the best model I can create of what this reality would be. And in fiction, unless the fiction fails, the hypothesis does not get exploded. But at the same time, you always understand its hypothetical nature. Whereas in science, said Marlon, the hypothesis is floated and retrieves what it can and explodes if it needs to. And then Marcelo asked her an intriguing question. Do you feel, when you write and create characters, do you feel like they drive you in a certain way? Marlon, again with her signature laughter, absolutely, and thank God when they do. Marcelo, because we do too. You know, when you're working on a technical problem, it seems to have a way to go, that we're not always in control. We're just making sure all the minus signs and the plus signs match. Marlon, wonderful. Marcelo, But it really has a way that it wants to go, which is kind of beyond what we have total control of. Marlon, that's fascinating. It is. Marcelo, and when you find the solution, something that looks like a solution, you get emotionally moved to an amazing extent, especially when it's a surprising thing. It really is a spiritual emotion. Like I've had this a few times, not many. I actually probably had it several times, but I just had a couple. But when I have this, it really is something transcendent. This affinity between Marcelo, the physicist, and Marlon, the novelist, stands in a great tradition. We think of the affinity between Goethe and Alexander von Humboldt, or in the last century, between the writer Albert Camus and the biologist Jacques Monod, chronicled by Sean Carroll in his new book. When Camus published some of his occasional writings in 1950, he dedicated the volume to his friend, à Jacques Monod, sur un même chemin, fraternellement, Albert Camus, to Jacques Monod, on the same path, fraternally, Albert Camus. On the same path, fraternally, it is when such affinity leads to amity that new neighborhoods are made between the sciences and the humanities, to the benefit not only of the intellectual world, but also of society at large. To make such sociable and public-spirited neighborhoods, we must, yes, do the necessary thing and set up the right institutional setting and devise a rich interdisciplinary program and set of conversations, as here wonderfully at ICE. But in the end, that commendable endeavor is not enough, not sufficient, to ensure the cross-disciplinary engagement at its deepest level. It is the person-to-person, face-to-face relations, the building of mutual trust and understanding, the personal acquaintance and discovery of professional affinities between particular scientists and particular humanists, leading to lasting and lifelong friendships, which make for a true neighborhood across disciplines, rather than the brief encounter that too often passes for interdisciplinarity at the occasional seminar or conference. The affinity of intellectual quests, leading to the amity of personal friendships, is the way to overcome the cultural divide and the false notion that we are incompatible apples and oranges. But there is one more step we must take. Such affinity and amity must draw us into building research alliances across the sciences and humanities. It is by working together in a cross-disciplinary inquiry that strong and lasting neighborhoods are made. ICE will succeed not only because of the brilliant scientists and humanists it attracts into its programs of cross-disciplinary engagement, as in this founding conference, as we've already seen this afternoon. But it will succeed especially because of the gift for friendship and cooperation of its founding director. It is Marcelo's lifelong personal engagement with humanists as a scientist that has led to this happy professional marriage of our two cultures. My own center was born out of such friendships across disciplines. In his acceptance speech on receiving the Templeton Prize in 1986, our founder here, James McCord, spoke movingly of the friendships he had formed with scientists in neighboring universities, first in the University of Texas at Austin and then in Princeton. It was the values he saw in the scientists that inspired him to create an interdisciplinary research center for theological inquiry, dedication to scholarship, openness to new ideas from whatever source, generosity of spirit in human relations, and a commitment to common concerns across disciplinary boundaries. In his friendships with scientists, the founder of my institution, the theological educator, recognized the affinity of these shared transcendent values across all forms of human inquiry. It led him to open a center which he said had been designed in every aspect to be an environment conducive to fresh thinking. So in closing, how do we go about instituting interdisciplinarity at the center of theological inquiry in our environment for fresh thinking in Princeton? How do we meet the cultural challenge of making a neighborhood between theologians and anthropologists, theologians and psychologists, or, as in this picture, theologians and legal scholars, as we've sought to do in recent years? How are we doing it now in our current program with scientists in astrobiology, like Frank Rosenzweig, or Ed Turner, or Michael Hecht, and scholars in the humanities, like the philosopher Susan Schneider, working on artificial intelligence and the search for life in the cosmos? We are not alone in meeting this challenge. Happily, there is now a body of research on doing interdisciplinary research that we can all draw on to inform our work. I've been especially indebted to colleagues at my former University of Edinburgh who've conducted many case studies of interdisciplinary collaboration between the natural and the social sciences. The fruit of this applied research by Catherine Lyle, Anne Bruce, Joyce Tate, and Laura Mager can be found in their co-authored volume, Interdisciplinary Research Journeys. There they recognize the importance of what they call the human dimension. From many case studies, they write this: human considerations are at least as important as the disciplinary component of the collaboration. Being familiar with people, their working styles, and the demands and pressures under which they work is an important aspect of any collaboration. But in an interdisciplinary project, those are crucial. The project is likely to require a degree of trust in colleagues whose methods may not be familiar and whose contribution may be questioned by those who do not understand what constitutes good research in that discipline. That has been our experience at the Centre of Theological Inquiry over 4 decades now. It was certainly the experience and the case when we convened this group of scholars in our inquiry on evolution and human nature in 2012. As several of the evolutionary anthropologists I interviewed for a place in this inquiry said to me, "What is theology? I've never heard of it." And yet during that year together, as a residential research community, these 12 evolutionary scientists and theologians built high levels of trust and a richer understanding of each other's approach to the study of human nature. More than that, they gained new insights from the bifocal vision of two disciplinary perspectives on human nature. So much so that the inquiry has now led to a new cross-disciplinary postdoctoral program in theology and anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. This initiative is led by these 2 participating scholars in our inquiry, anthropologist Augustine Fuentes and theologian Celia Dean Drummond. It grew directly out of their year together in our environment for fresh thinking, where they discovered first affinities in new research alliances that became deeply rooted in amity, in friendship. Here's how Fuentes described his cross-disciplinary experience as an evolutionary scientist in our program. That is the hallmark of the CTI, a place where ideas infuse one another, potentially altering the structure of the ideas themselves. That kind of interface is exactly what the scholarly life should be. I think we lose that in the universities sometimes because we're so focused on disciplinary boundaries forgetting that we created those boundaries, and that the world is not divided up into departments. Tell that to your departmental head. Indeed, the world is not divided into departments, and we who study its nature and culture need to cross the boundaries we have created to engage in a common quest for knowledge and wisdom. But the world itself is divided, and across its boundaries people are fleeing and natural species are disappearing. Next year, my center will launch a 4-year series of interdisciplinary inquiries on religion and forced migration, economic inequality, global conflict, and climate change. We are not a partisan think tank on those issues, but as responsible scholar citizens in the sciences and humanities, we are all called upon to make common cause for the common good. Let a physicist and a poet have the last word on this greatest of all cultural challenges, making the whole world a global neighborhood open to all. Fritz Stern concluded the introduction to his essays on Einstein's German world of the 1930s with this sobering thought. My generation saw a world descend into deepest barbarism and begin anew to build a civilized existence. We may still learn from the past, and we should still heed the physicist Lisa Meitner's insistence that civic passivity among the specially gifted and educated can lead to disaster. There is no danger of such passivity in this new neighborhood. It is made by a gifted physicist who studies the dark and invites the light. Marcelo, may the words of the poet from Scotland inspire the work of your new institute. Let the dark be dark. Let the stars shine properly, and let the darkness with no stars heal the damage caused by light. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. And very embarrassing. But
it's our privilege
great
to embarrass you.
And you were great on your timekeeping, I have to say. So we do have time for some questions. Yes, please.
You mentioned evolution a number of times in the course of your talk, and one of my, disappointments is that only 40% of Americans believe evolution is true. I think partly due to some religious activity in that area. What can be done about that?
The first interdisciplinary book that my center published way back in the early 80s was called God is Not a Creationist. And I think our work over the years has been to bring serious theologians into dialogue with scientists on a very respectful dialogue on evolutionary science, and to think through the implications of that science and these findings and these testable hypotheses in relation to religious and theological understandings of human nature, of the natural order, of what is and what matters, as was so beautifully put in the opening address. Coming from Europe, it is frankly a puzzle why this deep scissor in religious culture in America exists. I think it is the work of my center, which is not a religious confessional center, but an independent, not-for-profit educational research institute, but bringing scholars of religion and theologians together with scientists. It's our work to do serious publishable research, which at the same time is being disseminated into communities. Some pastors say to me, we don't want to come to your center, but we do want to read the books that your scholars are writing in serious critical engagement, just as philosophers do with scientists, theologians with scientists, offering their own critical inquiry and set of questions and insights, in the hope that this will help pastors and educators to help people in pews and congregations in different, not only in Christian churches, but in other religious traditions too, that skepticism of evolution exists. I know Muslim scholars, Islamic scholars, and scientists are working to gain the same understanding of and appreciation for evolutionary theory and science in their own religious traditions. So it is a challenge. I think only patient education and the demonstration at a high level of advanced research of the possibility of engagement by religion scholars and theologians with scientists, taking the evolutionary science seriously and showing why it is not a fundamental threat to sincere religious or informed religious belief is the challenge. There are historical reasons in terms of the history of religion and popular culture in the United States, going back beyond the Scopes trial. Part of it is, as someone has said, there's a very good book on fundamentalism by the historian George Marsden, that what was represented in the early 20th century was really the preservation of a certain understanding of the nature of science in the 18th century. That one could read off the natural order, the book of creation, God's purposes, and we could read the Bible in a similar way, like a telephone directory with just facts that you read off, rather than understanding scriptures in various traditions as being texts that have a whole range of literary genres and context and must be understood to bring that wisdom into dialogue with empirical science.
Question there.
Thanks. What are some lessons learned from your work on evaluation and like criteria for merit for new projects that are creating new things?
It's a very good question. We have an academic advisory panel of distinguished scholars who help us reflect on those questions. A very formative experience for me as an administrator of an interdisciplinary center was going to the Wissenschaftskolleg, the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin in 2007, early in my tenure as director, to meet the recently retired rector, Dieter Grimm, and the senior administrators, and reflect with them on their practice. For our center, we look for questions, new and emerging areas of interdisciplinary research. Not well-established ones, I feel, but new and emerging areas of cross-disciplinary research where we think, because of the nature of our discipline, pivot discipline, home discipline, theology has much to learn and perhaps something to contribute. So that's our criteria of what we get into. But at the Wissenschaftskolleg, the senior administrator told me a story of, they're funded through the federal government, and eventually the federal government Department of Ministry of Education said, you're a research institute like no other, an institute for advanced study. You're going into new areas in a cross-disciplinary way. We have no idea how to evaluate you. So we'd like you to invent your own form of evaluation and tell us how we should evaluate you, which challenges all notions of German bureaucracy fundamentally. And what they came up with was this, that they went to scholars who'd been in residence as members of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Grunewald in Berlin 5 years before the period of assessment. And they asked them to write essays on how the experience of being in that interdisciplinary environment for a year had changed their lives. In other words, they asked for an ancient form of literature. They asked for testimonies about the transformation of the person, the scholar, which I think for me has had a deep influence on my understanding of the kind of work we're doing and why in my presentation I was talking about the importance of the person-to-person relations, the community of trust and vulnerability in order to explore, to do the hard work of understanding the research methods and criteria for evaluation of good research in another field you don't know. My colleagues in Edinburgh who wrote this fine book on interdisciplinary journeys, they said you cannot typically be research expert in two fields. There are some exceptional people who are. But what you seek to be in interdisciplinary inquiry is to be conversationally expert in the other field. So to be talking as theologians with evolutionary scientists and dismissing the science in some misunderstanding of ancient texts as if they were telephone directory scientific facts, that would be an example of not being conversationally expert in a dramatic way in the other field. So testimony, new areas where we think will be vulnerable and perturbed and disturbed, but in a creative way. And the hard work of gaining the competence to have a conversation. But a great question, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about, what you showed our leader here from ICE and a novelist and the interplay between the scientist and the novelist. And really what I want to know more about is the scientists may tend to be, and maybe this is the way I see it, is that they tend to be more cloistered than, say, the artist. And is there a part of the evolutionary piece is telling the science story to the world at large? Anything about that coming out of what's happening in terms of the scientists interacting with humanities people, where they in turn can tell their stories and what they're working on and their research, to touch a wider world?
More compelling way, yes. Yeah. Several years ago, we ran a 3-week intensive residential workshop run by Marlon Robinson on creative writing for theologians, how theologians could write for wider audiences. Maybe we should next ask her to write one, to hold one for scientists and have a creative writing workshop for scientists. But it's striking to me that the senior scientists we have the privilege of working with often have a background interest in philosophy or literature that is active and informed. So we're very privileged this year to have a senior lab scientist leader, Frank Rosenzweig, who's just moved the Rosenzweig lab to Georgia Institute of Technology. Frank's first degree is a degree in comparative literature. And he brings that sensibility and literary imagination in communicating his work. And maybe that is a contribution that the dialogue and residential experience or the intensive conference experience here at ICE, that's what maybe some humanists who are not in certain kinds of literary jargon or whatever could help. But I think there you're raising the wider issue, which is about the public responsibility beyond bringing the 2 or 3 cultures together. How can those cultures speak to the wider public society? And that's why I wanted to end partly as a tribute to a person who had the privilege of getting to know in the last years of life, Fritz Stern, this afternoon, remembered at Columbia. But that very moving quote from Lisa Meitner, who, as a physicist in Germany in the 30s, had to go into exile into Sweden, and felt that people like Max Planck and others had been passive. Let's just wait this out. And the consequence of that passivity in that's at an extreme level of oppression and violence and totalitarianism. But if we're passive in our public responsibility to share what we do, then it leads to religious communities having bad science under the impression that it's good exegesis of a text. But even more widely, we need to do that. Thank you.
Great, that was very good. Thank you so much, Will, for your presentation. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to have Casey Cole come up. So I met Casey many years ago, and she was a science journalist and writer for the LA Times, and she has written many wonderful books about scientists and their struggles, so to speak, right? And she is currently a professor of communication at the University of Southern California. And she was just, what was exactly your position at the Institute for Advanced Study?
I'm actually going to mention that.
Oh, you will?
That was
Excellent.
Director's visitor.
Okay, so there you go. This is a perfect example of how this can work. Okay, and she's now going to talk to us about Science for the Soul, the Sentimental Fruits. And let me get this out of here.
Yeah, so.
You speak here. This is your
Podium.
This
thing.
is your mic.
Okay.
Oh, you mean a podium to read?
I thought he was. No, I'm
Nope.
fine. I'm good. I'm good.
Here's this. I put this down.
Oh, you put that down.
Yes.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
That's what I was thinking.
Very
But over here. Okay.
efficient.
No, I'm going to try not to do this. I didn't want to do a PowerPoint either because I've heard that while PowerPoint corrupts completely. I sort of agree. And I'm also going to try not to read. So I'll try to come somewhere in the middle. I wanted to say that in speaking of making this neighborhood, it was really strange because when I was director's visitor at the Institute for Advanced Study, which has a lot of different disciplines, on the one side I had Juan Maldacena, who is one of our greatest physicists today, and on the other side Elaine Pagel. So my house was between these two houses. One of the visitors I had down while I was there, though, was Sean B. Carroll, and I am so glad that you put that book up because Brave Genius, it's a bad title for probably the best book I think I've read in years on any subject at all. And it had a special resonance for me, as you'll find out, because the people I learned physics from were basically the atomic bomb scientists, and they struggled very hard with this question of how do you remain a good person in horrible times, which is what so much of what this book about the relationship between Camus and Monod was about, which I had not known. So thank you for that. So yeah, I am going to talk about the sentimental fruits of science. When journalists write about scientific discoveries, we're inevitably asked to say, what good is it? What the editors mean is what practical use is it, not what good is it for our morality, our values, our feelings. That's not very surprising, but it is, of course, very wrong, especially in this wonderful context. Thank you, Marcelo. Even in perhaps the most trivial and obvious ways, I think what we've learned from the natural world moves us. We're tree huggers for a reason. We descend from trees. We rely on them for our survival. We're drawn to the moon, perhaps not even realizing that we're anchored. The Earth is anchored by its tilt, and without it, we wouldn't have seasons or tides or life. As Sagan so famously pointed out, we are star stuff. I think much more immediately, we are sun stuff. I like to say sunlight becomes me. That is literally true. But the cheese sandwich we had for lunch came from green grass that somehow converted that sunlight into energy that became me. So the late physicist Frank Oppenheimer, who was the one who was responsible for getting me interested in science, talked often about the sentimental fruits of science. That's his term. That science is useful not only in a practical way, but in the way that it makes us think and feel about things. And he thought that one of the reasons that people turned away from science was that it has not succeeded in changing the way people look at themselves. Frank always carried around, see, am I doing this right? Perfect, that's good. I noticed that I wanted to be able to look at the whole audience. So, okay. He used to carry around a little red book, not that red book. This was a book by the philosopher Max Otto. It was written in 1949 and cost 35 cents. And the title of the book was Science and the Moral Life. And like Frank, Otto argued that it's perfectly appropriate to then extend scientific thinking outside into the realm of values. As he said, not in the sense of emptying human life into test tubes, but rather in the sense of the dependable, objectively testable kind of thinking, which is the rule in the natural sciences, should be put to work in the great laboratory of man's search for good life, the good life richly and profoundly conceived. And I actually took out a quote that I had in earlier, but I have to put back in given what you just said. He said that scientists must do this as their absolute duty, or the better interests of life, as he put it, are doomed. And obviously, this is a really old idea. I mean, depending on how you want to define science, it goes back at least as far as Lucretius. I was surprised to find that in Newton's Philosophy of Nature by John Newton Randall of Columbia University, he said the following: Newton himself, and even those who attacked him, would all alike have been amazed at the more recent contention that natural science has nothing to do with values, and that it can and should remain value-free, and that those seeking a direction for human life have nothing to learn from our best knowledge of the nature of things. Even a little science, he concluded, is a thing of infinite promise for human values. The physicist Max Born once famously remarked on how the physics of one era inevitably becomes the metaphysics of the next. When the physicist Robert Wilson wanted to talk Congress into funding a multi-million-dollar particle accelerator, Fermilab, he didn't talk about what practical fruits it might bring. He actually talked about, and I'm quoting, the respect with which we regard one another, the dignity of people, our love of culture. And biologist Jacques Vanneau, of course I have him in here too, toward the end of his life, wrote a whole series of essays on the value on values in the age of science. And he said, I feel the most important results of science have been to change the relationship of man to the universe, or the way he sees himself in the universe. So I'd like to share some of my favorite sentimental fruits of science, the ways I think science speaks directly to values, and that's a little bit random. They're based on things I've been thinking about recently. One of them is that we take such comfort in the connectivity of the universe. It is really odd to me when I hear people talk about the environment as if it were something out there or alien, or some kind of special interest lobby, when we are the environment, and the environment is us, and there's no life has drastically changed just about everything, the atmosphere, the land, everything that we know about on Earth, and vice versa. It's certainly that the atmosphere and the Earth has determined the way we are. We've also learned that we're part of this really vast, extended family tree. Those blue eyes, I've been told, might mean we have Neanderthals in our family tree, some of us. But we're related not only to each other, but to dinosaurs, insects, fungus, all the rest of life. Even our bodies are usually cooperating communities of microbes. How can these kinds of insights possibly not affect the way we feel about our relationship with other people, and it's in addition to the entire living and even inanimate world around us? So I'm going to move over to physics for a minute, which is where I came into all of this. I remember when Frank Oppenheimer said to me that the golden rule was based on the same principles as Einstein's theories, I should say, of relativity, because they were both based essentially on symmetry. It's probably the most powerful idea, I think, in physics, even to this day. A symmetry tells you what doesn't change no matter what. It's a change that doesn't make a difference. They're the invariants of nature. Applied to the golden rule, the implication seems kind of obvious. You do unto others as you would have others do unto you. That means that doer and doee can change places. You're in a symmetrical situation. So who you are is a difference. It doesn't make a difference. The outcome is the same. So it's not so obvious when it comes to the speed of light. But I think there's an important fundamental lesson here that Frank was trying to get at. So as you know, the speed of light is part of the very fabric of the universe, a consequence of the way that electric and magnetic fields interact with each other and create this wave that travels through space at 186,000 miles per second. a speed that never changes. So you can run away from a light beam as fast as you care to, and it would still come at you at 186,000 miles per second. And that's a really, 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 really strange thing. It's really odd because speed is a measure of distance over time. So if this speed is fundamental, that never changes, what does that say about space and time? It says they can't be fundamental. They have to be elastic. They have to give. The thing that doesn't change, the invariant, makes the other things, the bedrock, the stuff we thought was absolutely true, it makes those things now secondary to the fundamental thing. And the same is true for another consequence of Einstein's special relativity, equals mc squared. Energy is the same as matter. It doesn't make a difference. It seems to, but the fundamental thing doesn't make a difference. So if the sun loses 24 ocean liners worth of mass every second, as Phil Morrison used to say, and turn it into energy, it seems to make a difference, but the fundamental thing, the amount of energy, stays the same, is invariant. A kiss is still a kiss. What other fundamental things apply as time goes by? I think that's a really important question. So notions of symmetry have already been encoded into all forms of law as well as a measure of fairness. If you divide a piece of property fairly, then the two sides should in some way be symmetrical. Maybe one part of the land has a lot of oil, the other part of the land has more space, a lot of trees. But if the deal is fair, then both sides must perceive that they're roughly equal and that they could trade sides and it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference. These sorts of solutions are said to be envy-free, which I really like. The sides can trade without endless cycles of rancor and revenge and ultimately descend into what Frank actually thought was the worst thing a bad person could ever do to you, which was to make you into a bad person, or as he put it much more succinctly, the worst thing a son of a bitch can do is turn you into a son of a bitch. A really good life lesson, I find. So some of these actually sentimental fruits I find intensely practical. For example, really rude drivers. I try really hard to remember that the worst thing they could do is turn me into them. So I've been talking about the things that don't change, but obviously change is fundamental as well. And that insight, I think, also has had a huge effect on the way we think and feel about many, many things. There was a time when everything from the positions of the stars to the status of slaves and women were fixed. Now we know that everything changes all the time, that stars are born and die, that our atmosphere is created daily by plants. It had been a deadly poison when we first got here. If change is the way of the world, then progress at least is possible. Tomorrow will not be the same as today, and the social and economic status of people can change, which is the idea at the heart of democracy. Frank wrote, "When I go to New York and I see new buildings go up, or when I see scratches on a rock and know that the rock came from a glacier, it reminds me that the world is always progressing, or at least it is always changing, and that leaves the possibility of progress open." We say things change as the effect of causes, and a lot of science is devoted to figuring out what causes things. So I want to talk about just one cause today, which I think takes us to a sentimental fruit that is not at all obvious. Actually, a lot of them aren't. It's not obvious at all that if I drop this paperclip, what made it go down to the desk is the curvature of space-time. That was a pretty hard thing to figure out. You can't just see that by looking. I think we have a special problem when it comes to probability, and scientists have wrestled with this for a long time. But in daily life, we think of chance, and we think of something is pure chance and something that has a cause as complete opposites. But if you think of a cause as anything that makes something more likely to happen, then probability is as much a cause of things than anything else. So if you look at, for example, what is the cause that would make to die come up with the number 7 more often than every other combination? It's simply because there are more ways for 7 to come up. It can be 1 and 6, 6 and 1, 3 and 4, 4 and 3, 2 and 5, and so forth. You have many, many, many ways that you can get the number 7, many, many more ways than you can get any other combination of numbers. Therefore, the probability becomes a cause. Closets, things can get, things become more probable when there are more ways that things can happen. Okay, so closets get messier when there's more ways they can get messy. So if you have 2 pairs of shoes, you don't have much of a problem. If you have 100 pairs of shoes, you're probably going to have a messy closet. So what's this got to do with how we feel about things? How do we feel about guns? A subject on which I think we are clearly incoherent at this point anyway. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. That makes sense. That feels about right. On the other hand, there are about 6 gun dealers in the U.S. for every Starbucks. Gun sellers, they outnumber grocery stores and McDonald's. But the reasoning is that having firearms being more probable is not a cause of them being used violently. That's the popular wisdom, and I would say that's really wrong, because when anything gets to be very, very, very probable, and there are many, many, many ways for it to happen, it's going to happen. Speaking of equivalence, I recently learned that when the Second Amendment was written, a typical musket took a minute to load, and that our modern automatic weapons can, of course, fire thousands of rounds a minute, which has radically changed the probability that someone is going to get hurt by a gun. So feeling scared about this situation is perfectly understandable. It's kind of an intuitively understood sentimental fruit, I think, of understanding something about causes and the way they work. Of course, feeling scared isn't necessarily very useful. I used to talk to Frank and his friends about, why didn't you make people more scared of nuclear weapons so they wouldn't build so many of them? And he said, we did make them scared. It doesn't do any good. You have to make people angry. One of the things he tried very hard to get across to people was the difference that a factor of 1,000 makes, which is roughly the difference between the conventional bombs at the time and an atomic bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. It's not something humans can readily perceive without math, because our brains tend to see these increases logarithmically. So instead of a factor of 1,000, we tend to see it as a factor of 3, 10 to the 3rd power. So as did so many other scientists, or scientists, when they try to explain things that are not intuitive, Frank told stories, and one of his stories was, imagine that you have a dinner party for 4 people and 4,000 show up, and you have to use the same dishes, the same plates, the same chairs, the same house, etc. It's a really, really, really big qualitative difference. And that was really the point he was making, was that increases in quantity change quality. Quality and quantity are not opposed any more than cause and chance are. They're different sides of the same thing. In the physical world, it's really easy to show that quantity changes quality, whether we're talking about temperature or just about any other measure. Actually, one of my favorite examples, again, from Phil Morrison, was that there's nothing in our universe the size of Jupiter shaped like a teacup. I actually stole that for the title of a book. But if you look out in the universe, everything that is big enough gets round or roundish, and everything that gets small enough, of course, takes on very, very different properties. A single particle can exist in a state of uncertainty, being here and there simultaneously, or dead or alive, if you like. Collections of particles, however, have no such quality. So poor Schrodinger's famous cat would in fact probably contain I don't know, an uncountable number of atoms, according to a chemist friend, about 10 to the 26th power. So there's no such thing as an atomic scale cat, and knowing everything you can know about every atom in your cat is not going to tell you whether it's going to sit on your lap and purr or throw up on the rug, or both. So in a very real way, quantity determines quality. And this is something I noticed recently personally walking around my neighborhood, which is a very modest set of houses that were built for the McDonnell Douglas workers during World War II. This is in a part of Santa Monica that used to be very neighborly and very small cookie-cutter houses. So I've recently noticed that there's a lot of dog poop on the sidewalks, which is something that never used to happen. I've also been noticing neighbors saying hi to each other in the evenings as they take walks. That's something that did used to happen and doesn't happen anymore. What's happened is that an invasion, if I can use that word, from Silicon Beach has brought in not just more people, but a lot more money on a scale that is really mammoth. And homes are being torn down left and right. These huge houses just tower over, making the little ones look almost like toys. They take away the light. I noticed that a lot of the new owners of these big houses, they don't live in the neighborhood. They're investors. So none of this is new. Even in my neighborhood, none of this is new. But lately I have definitely sensed a palpable tipping point. Things are different. You know, we're not in Kansas anymore. A surprising range of people are worried about the size and the rate of this change. I was amazed to read a New York Times piece by Peter Georgescu, I think that's correct. He's the chairman of the advertising giant Young and Rubicon. He's worried about income inequality. He's scared, he said, and he said his billionaire friends are scared. They know that what they're seeing is not just more of the same. They're seeing something qualitatively different. Quote, "We risk losing the capitalist engine that brought us great economic success." And there he touches on a point that mathematicians and evolutionary biologists have known for a long time. If you eat all the prey, in effect, there's nothing left to prey on. So cooperation is a much better strategy for long-term survival than outright competition. And I think that understanding may well be the most powerful fruit of science of all, the fact that we can think that the world is understandable. Again, this is not a new idea, but when we don't understand things, we act in irrational, stupid ways. This is Lucretius, 55 or so BC. "This dread and darkness of mind cannot be dispelled by sunbeams, the shining shaft of day, but only by an understanding of the outward form and the inner workings of nature." So lightning, earthquakes, floods, birth defects, everything were once seen as either a retribution for a sin or some kind of portent of a catastrophe. And not knowing what to do about all these associated terrors, people understandably resorted to everything, from ceremonies like dances to ceremonies like human sacrifice. And as we know all too well, irrational terrors lead to frantic, incoherent, and usually ineffective behavior. So simply believing the world is understandable is an enormously powerful gift of science. A trust in understanding allows us to use persuasion to change people's minds instead of having to rely on coercion. Something Frank talked about a lot. I should apologize for all these Frankisms. I can't help it. These were all my Yodas. Anyway, he frequently said, if we stop trying to understand things, we'll all be sunk. And when people stop trying to understand things about the physical world, they stop trying to understand things about the social world as well. I think one thing we've learned for sure about understanding is that it's always uncertain, and that's another dangerous and very popular misconception that science is about certainty, and uncertainty is a sign of either weakness or ignorance. Actually, what I love about science is that you're supposed to quantify uncertainty. Exactly. You're supposed to say all the ways that you actually might be wrong. And among physicists, at least, one of the most talked about sentimental fruits, which also speaks directly to what both of you were talking about, is that understanding frequently requires holding in your mind at the same time two very different understandings of the same thing. So the opposite of truth is not heresy. To understand an elementary particle, you need to understand it as a particle and as a wave, because they're dual descriptions of the same thing. Such dualities are behind so much progress in modern physics. String theory, which is the focus of my most recent writing, is all about dualities. The theory of quantum gravity in 5 dimensions is equivalent to a theory without gravity in 4 dimensions. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that the theoretical physicists were really at each other's throats, because these two ways of looking at things, the stringy view and the particle view, were just completely at odds with each other. And that is no longer the case. They found that in many ways there are dualities that people did not realize existed. And of course, human thinking is full of such powerful dualities. I'm madly in love, nothing but a lot of complicated chemistry. I have free will and I don't. All of these things that confuse us. My social psychologist friend Carol Tavares, who I love because she introduced me to the works of Rebecca, actually, initially, is always talking about cognitive dissonance and how humans have an innate need to resolve cognitive dissonance, that we can't hold in our minds two contradictory things. I love smoking. Smoking's going to kill me. You either have to talk yourself out of the fact that smoking is going to kill you or give it up. The great thing about physics is you don't need to do that. You have to be able to hold two contradictory things in your mind at the same time. And it not just feels right, it leads to all kinds of discoveries. Frank thought that if people understood these dualities, these two ways of seeing things, multiple ways of seeing things, that they could relax a little bit about the contradictions that complicate our lives and often tear people apart and maybe lead to policies that would better deal with the conflicts we face. He loved to quote Bohr. Well, they all love to quote Bohr. The opposite of a shallow truth is false. That the opposite of a deep truth is also true. That here's Bohr again. And this is where it's so profoundly ironic that people think science is a one-way street to the right answer. This loosening of the rules of thinking seems to me the greatest blessing which modern science has given us. The belief that there is one truth and that oneself is in possession of it seems to me the greatest root, the deepest root of all the evil that is in the world. So there's Bohr for you. How am I on time? Am I good? Oh, perfect. Okay. So obviously science is one very powerful way of understanding things. I would especially say mathematics, because it distills things. I had a wonderful conversation with mathematician Ingrid Dobche when I was writing about wavelet analysis, or I think that's what it was. And she said, you know, being a MacArthur Fellow actually taught me that math is a lot like poetry. You take a very complicated situation, you distill it down to its essence, and then you figure out how are you going to communicate that. But there are many other ways to understand things, of course, and Frank was one person who argued very strongly that the discoveries of artists were as valid and as important as those of scientists. And he actually, the place he created in San Francisco, which is oddly named an exploratorium, was actually a museum of human awareness. And science and art are absolutely equal partners and have been from day one. So I'm going to end with what's probably the most quoted Frankism of all, because we all find it inspirational, and because it reminds me of what you're trying to do here, which is sort of unprecedented, and a lot of people are probably going to say, it's been tried, you can't do that. So I want to tell you what Frank would say when people would tell him, well, you can't do that. You know, after all, you have to accept that we live in the real world. To which he would answer, it's not the real world, it's a world we made up, and we can make it in another way if we want to. So, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. Sorry, I had to look down.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, questions? Anyone?
This one in the back. Way
I
back.
don't see. Okay. Good. No, I didn't do my running today. This is good.
Glad to help then. Hi there. I have a question about whether or not you believe that scientists have a unique kind of moral responsibility for the science that either they create or that they have a unique understanding of. And the reason that I ask you this is because I'm a medical student. I'm on the board of the Physicians for Human Rights. And whenever I talk to chemists about speaking out against chemical weapons, I get just no response or
Right.
looks of absolute disdain.
Right.
And I feel as if I'm making an argument saying that you have a unique understanding of these, of what these things do and what they can do to people, and just no response at all. And so I'm wondering, I guess, I apologize, I guess it's a two-part question. A, in general, do scientists have a unique moral responsibility? And B, what can I say to these
To the
chemists
chemists?
who
Yeah.
don't seem to
I
care?
I actually have a real answer for that. I'm very excited that at USC next quarter I'm going to be teaching a class in the science behind human values. And one of the sets of readings are by Roald Hoffman. Roald Hoffman is a Nobel laureate in chemistry who writes a lot about values and thinks that, yes, the chemist does have a responsibility to think about morality and values. His work is amazing. Just Google him. He's a poet and a playwright, and we've worked together on art and science things forever. Actually, I should say that to speak to the purpose of this conference, we started a thing at the Cornelia Street Cafe in New York with Oliver Sacks. It's still going on after 20 years. It's called Entertaining Science, and we always have art, performance of some kind, and science all interacting and pushing back at each other. And then in Santa Monica, where I now am, I reconfigured it, because we're in an artist gallery and studios, as Categorically Not. And Categorically Not name came from an artist friend of mine who used to say that the worst disease afflicting humankind was hardening of the categories. So this ice is perfect for that. As to whether scientists should have, all I can say, and I think it's really important, is that people don't realize that a lot of them have felt that and been extremely vocal about it. I knew about the physicists. I did not know about the biologists until I read Sean B. Carroll. I know that mathematicians, certainly in evolutionary science, that's kind of I was trying to go in a different direction with physics and math and chemistry. Anyway, Google Roald Hoffman, his work on science and morality. If you can't find it, send me an email. I'll get it to you.
If I could make a comment on this, because it's an awesome question. This is a perfect example of how liberal arts education should work. Because when you're trained as a scientist, you get no courses on, say, science and morality, for example, on the history of how scientific applications changed the history of the 20th century. And I think that should be an inclusive part of any scientist training, So I think this sort of oblivion is mostly from ignorance, and so one thing that could be done is to make sure that courses are the courses are required, for scientists, and at the graduate level as well, so that things like that, they're not so hard.
They don't know it's okay to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if they can just find that out, then it's great. It's a question from...
Let's have, the hands are up on that side. So, no, you go first now.
Casey, the issue of science and politics is one that, I think is very beguiling now. So, I do a lot of writing about, on the blog, about climate change, right? And even though NPR has, you would think would be pretty, liberal and educated, the comments are always horrifying. And part of the problem is, it's not clear how scientists are supposed to stand in relation to an issue that is politically debated. So like Andy Revkin says, it's very important, if you're a scientist, to speak with two sentences. I am a scientist, but as a citizen, right? Because there's this whole issue that people give us authority as scientists because of our expertise. And yet, on a political issue, we risk sort of losing that authority because now we're stepping into the political domain.
Okay, I think that's because of the way the evidence is, let me say, not presented. When either scientists or journalists talk about climate change, for example, or evolution is an even better example as opposed to creationism, they say, well, the creationists say that evolution doesn't make sense. And the scientists say it does. Well, it doesn't actually. It makes absolutely no sense. I mean, does it make any sense that all of us evolved from some single-celled organism? No. So you have to give that it doesn't make sense. However, all these 5 lines of evidence point to it, and that's why we know that it's true. Instead of setting it up as an either-or, which the scientists themselves and the journalists often do, as a he said, she said kind of thing, which it isn't. Here's the evidence. So I think we've not done a great job on that. Climate change, I think the understanding exponential growth of the way we see things logarithmically too is really key to that because, it's a thing that is snowballing like snowballs snowball. The faster it goes. And that's very hard for people to, it's not intuitive. It's not something we can perceive without math. So it would be a good thing if they took, I always try to get across to readers at first, look, this isn't going to make any sense, but. Because it doesn't make any sense.
So this is a wonderful conversation, and you brought up so many great issues. I think as a scientist I build quantum computers, and almost all my work is funded by the Defense Department. Yeah. Who is, by the way, the Defense Department is much more imaginative and forward-thinking about funding fundamental research than the NSF.
Yes, that's true.
By quite a lot.
True.
The NSF is quite stodgy and conservative. I'm a Quaker, and when I first started off my career and I was getting my first grant, it was from the ONR, the Office of Naval Research. And I was concerned about the question of, whether this was okay or not. And I went to Johnny Wheeler, who was, if you know Johnny Wheeler, or he recently died, he was Feynman's supervisor. He worked on the hydrogen bomb project, quite socially conservative, but an amazing and wonderful guy who liked blowing things up. And I asked him about this, and he said, well, first of all, if you yourself feel that, you don't want to build a device that's going to hurt people, then don't do it. Okay, that's the first thing. He said, that's fine. He said, however, in terms of being funded by the Defense Department, remember that we live in a democracy and that it's really up to citizens, and I'm actually channeling what you were just saying, it's up to citizens and a democratic society to determine the use of the scientific discoveries that are funded in this society. It's actually not up to you. So I don't think that scientists have a unique moral responsibility here, other than to make this choice about, do I want to work on this or not? It's really up to all of us as citizens to we have a unique moral relationship with science, not just scientists, right. Which is where popularizing of science and explaining it to people is extremely important. I mean, as citizens have a right to know what the science means. Most scientists are really bad at explaining it. Yeah. I mean, the real moral responsibility, I hate to say it, lies with popular description of science so that citizens can figure out what the heck is going on and vote accordingly.
Well, here's another interesting surprise in terms of funding that I just learned from one of my students. So it's kind of a given that journalism, which doesn't exist anymore in the way that I knew it anyway, and certainly science journalism, there are some really good outlets, but Quanta magazine, I would say, for one, but not a whole lot. So a student who is doing what they call branded content, you know, when you go on the page one of the New York Times, it's really annoying because you'll start reading something and it will say, from our advertisers. But that actually she had a lot more freedom, say, doing a piece on the tropical forest paid for by Toyota. And when you think of the PBS model, or a lot of these things that are, in a way, branded content, we started our blog on NPR, 13.7. I mean, basically, they are more and more branding their content and saying that these are the people who give us money, and you should, you know, you should use their businesses because that would be good for us. So it's not the Defense Department versus NSF. I think it's maybe flipping a little bit that way with journalism as well, because the old model is gone and new things are coming to replace it, I hope. But that might be one of them. Surprise. It could happen.
Okay, unfortunately, we need to move on to our last presentation today. Thank you, Casey. And our next speaker is Mary Jane Rubenstein. She is actually an ICE fellow right now, but in her real life, she's a professor of religion and gender studies at Wesleyan University. I've met her because of her book on the multiverse, which I thought was a wonderful piece of work. And we've been friends ever since, and I'm delighted that she's here and that she's going to tell us about the multiverse. I think it's something like the multiverse, God and the multiverse, a melodrama. So, all right, thanks.
I'd like to, if you, I know we've
Do
been
you
here
want?
for a while. If you want to sort of stand up.
She's also a big yoga person, so do you want this or do you
No.
want the other?
Okay. While you're standing and stretching, I'd just love to thank Marcelo and Amy for this wonderful day. I'm looking forward to tomorrow also, and to thank all of you for hanging in this long. I will do my best not to bore you. I apologize in advance if I fail in that regard. But it's a real joy to be here. All right, so here we go. In an afterword to a popular book by theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss, so now we're in this popular science universe. In an afterword, the ever iconoclastic Richard Dawkins declares that with this particular text, science has finally done away with God. If Darwin's Origin of Species put the old man on the ropes, Dawkins writes, then Krauss's universe from nothing has dealt the knockout blow. Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow make a similar claim in their 2010 Grand Design, with a similar reference to natural selection. Darwin drove God out of the biosphere, they tell us, and now we're driving him out of the cosmos, and the internet explodes. What is it that's so theologically devastating, so boldly deicidal about Hawking and Dawkins and Krauss? Well, the physical and mathematical specifics vary from model to model, but philosophically, what kills God in post-millennial cosmology is the notion that immanent processes can account for the birth of the whole universe without any external agent. Immanent processes can, in fact, account for a whole slew of universes, the hypothetical compendium of which is now being called the multiverse. Thanks variously to the quantum vacuum, or a sea of inflationary energy, or an imaginary number plugged into the time function of Einstein's gravitational equations, we don't need God to get creation going. And creation, one might note, was just about the last job God had left, considering that previous centuries had driven him out of biology, medicine, philosophy, poetry, and art. Even the standard Big Bang hypothesis had left open the possibility that some extra cosmic someone might have lit the cosmic fuse. But especially now that we've got folks like Hawking, Krauss, and Brian Greene telling us that physical processes give rise to universes all the time, we clearly don't need God. So God is dead and the multiverse has killed him. How? Simply stated, by substituting randomness for design. The argument that we now call intelligent design has got a long theological history. In medieval and early modern philosophies, it was called the teleological proof of the existence of God. The proof begins from the premise that the world around us is simply too perfect and too complex to have arisen by chance. It then proceeds by analogy to reason that if one were to stumble upon a complex machine, say a watch, on the ground, one could infer that it hadn't brought itself into being, but had rather been designed by an intelligent watchmaker. Similarly, when we examine the world in all its elegant complexity, we can infer that it didn't give birth to itself, but was designed by an intelligent world maker. Ironically, the premise of this teleological argument rears its head again in modern physics in the dilemma known as the fine-tuning problem. If gravity were any stronger, physicists tell us, then planets would crash into the sun. If the nuclear forces were any weaker, then atoms couldn't hold together. If the cosmological constant were any less repellent, then the universe would collapse into a fiery crunch. The question then becomes, how did these constants get so finely tuned? How do we have a universe full of planets and stars and plumbing and institutes when nearly any other combination of values would have given us nothing? And here's where things get urgent. Has anyone got an answer other than God? Enter the multiverse. If there's only one universe, the reasoning goes, then yes, it's strange to find it so star-filled and biophilic, considering how many other values the constants could have taken on. But if there are a whole bunch of universes apart from ours, then worlds are born all the time, trying on different values for different constants. Let's try this much gravity. Oh, that didn't work. That much gravity. Wow, that didn't work either. A really heavy electron. No, that's a disaster. Most of these worlds will be, in the words of David Hume, botched and bungled. But occasional ones will, in some sense of the word, work, and we're in one of those. No miracles, no plan, just a ton of possibilities and an infinite span of time and stuff to play with. Hence English physicist Bernard Carr's dictum, if you don't want God, you'd better have a multiverse. So there we have it. Science versus religion. Which side are you on? And it's a familiar standoff. In the US, at least, many states require science teachers to address both sides of the evolution debate, as if there were a debate and as if it had sides. Most of us live in a context in which televised conversations about science and religion tend to consist of two men on Fox News, one of whom blusters that God doesn't exist, the other whom blusters that yes he does, no he doesn't, yes he does, you are an ignorant buffoon, yeah well you are going to hell. Honestly, it's awful. In fact, it's worse than awful, it's boring. Whenever I teach philosophy of religion, I give away the punchline early on by telling my students that people have been really smart for a long time. If it were possible to prove or disprove the existence of an extra-cosmic humanoid creator, then somebody would have done it by now. But this is the problem with things outside the universe. They exceed our capacities to prove or disprove them. So at the risk of playing theological killjoy, I should probably say clearly that nothing will ever disprove the existence of God, not even the multiverse. After all, a theist can always say that an intelligent, benevolent God created the multiverse that created our universe. Conversely, nothing will ever prove the existence of God either. Human reason in the form of the natural, social, and human sciences can at this point account for the birth, order, and maintenance of the universe and its inhabitants without any recourse to an extra-cosmic father. There are no God-shaped gaps left. So it's here that I'd like to ask whether this God of the gaps, namely the omnipotent patriarch who transcends creation, is really the most interesting way to think about divinity, especially in the light of the ongoing kerfuffle over the multiverse. Does it exist? Is it really science? Does it solve the fine-tuning problem? Is there a fine-tuning problem? First, I'd like to give a bit of historical grounding to what I'm calling the melodrama of God and the multiverse. Strictly speaking, the multiverse has had a relatively short history. The term is a neologism coined at the end of the 19th century by the American philosopher William James, who used it to refer to the messiness of the world itself. More on this later if you are interested. And of course, the word multiverse has come roaring back since the turn of the millennium, emerging variously from the fields of quantum mechanics, loop quantum gravity, string theory, and inflationary cosmology. So when I use the term multiverse in an ancient or a medieval context, as I'm about to do, I will be using it anachronistically to refer to any cosmic scenario that imagines the whole visible order to be just one of many visible orders. My hope in delving into this past is to illuminate some visions of divinity in the face of the multiverse that are more intellectually and ethically satisfying than the ping-pong game of theism and atheism with their no he doesn't, yes he does. But first, a bit of the old melodrama. The theory of infinite worlds dates back in the Western tradition to the 5th century BCE, which is to say 2,500 years ago, with the atomist philosophers of ancient Greece. This is now their third mention this afternoon. For philosophers like Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, the universe was composed of microscopic, indivisible bits of matter, or atoms, from the Greek word for uncuttable. Apparently the first use of the word atomos in Greek was to refer to really nasty grass that was uncuttable. You couldn't cut it. And then it became a theory of atoms. Okay, but it started as grass. We are grass. These atoms moved eternally in a void, colliding haphazardly with one another until one of them swerved, Seth, and drew the others into a spiral vortex. In this vortex, heavy elements clustered together to form Earth, light elements scattered far from the center as fire, and mid-weight particles formed water and air in between them. So physical processes alone created the atomist world, no God necessary. Moreover, they argued, the void was spatially infinite and filled with an infinite amount of matter. So particles elsewhere were forming vortices elsewhere to create other worlds, even an infinite number of them. These worlds lived for a while and died, releasing their atoms back into the void, where they would go on to form new worlds elsewhere. Some worlds were very small, some large, some botched, some bungled, and some just like ours, and all of them made through the power of accidental movement. For Epicurus and his latter-day disciple Lucretius, the most attractive feature of this multiverse cosmology was that it freed humanity from the deities. This world, they taught, is the product of infinite accident, not some infinite God. To be clear, the Epicureans did not teach there were no gods, but rather that the gods were enlightened sages, living in blissed-out contemplation far beyond the boundaries of our world. They were not non-existent so much as irrelevant, having no reason to interrupt their quiet joy by muddling with mortals. For Lucretius in particular, this freedom from the gods came with profound ethical benefits. Once humans came to realize that this world was not created for us, we would cease to try to please the ones we thought had made it, whether through frivolous rituals, childish stories, or violent sacrifice. In other words, the atomists found in their multiverse the surest way to kill the gods. At least the gods understood as dominis superbis, or proud masters, cosmic monarchs who ruled the little world they kept in ignorance. Free from these proud masters, Epicureans could learn to see beyond the limits of our puny cosmos and contemplate an infinity of others, born and destroyed throughout infinite space. Now, if the atomists give us a primarily spatial model of the multiverse, with an infinite number of worlds strewn out in an infinite void, their rivals, the Stoics, gave us a temporal multiverse. Stoic philosophy was born just 6 years after the Epicurean school in 300 BCE, under the direction of Zeno of Citium. Like Epicurus, Zeno taught that the highest ethical good was to live a simple, imperturbable life, and that such a life could be attained through contemplation of the universe. That said, the two teachers disagreed vehemently over the nature of the universe and apparently hated one another. Against the Epicureans, the Stoics taught that there is no such thing as a smallest unit of matter, or atom. Rather, they argued matter is continuous, which is to say, infinitely divisible. If there are no atoms, then there is no void in which they must move. If there's no void, then there's nothing beyond our cosmos that might form others. For the Stoics, in short, ours is the only world in the world. While the Stoic world is singular, however, it is not eternal. Rather, The cosmos had a beginning and will have an end, specifically when the sun dries up the earth and consumes the world in flames, like it does. From these flames, a new universe will be born, live for a time, and then be set on fire again, and the process will repeat eternally. In contrast to the atomists' spatial multiplicity, then, the Stoics offered a temporal multiplicity. There's only one world right now, but it's destroyed and recreated like a phoenix throughout infinite time. This is by far the most distinct feature of early Stoic cosmology, the periodic destruction and regeneration of the universe, a process called ekpyrosis, literally out of fire. But wait, it gets weirder. Unlike the atomists, who pushed their gods all the way out of the cosmos, the early Stoics pulled their gods all the way in. For them, the world itself was a living creature, and the breath or spirit or reason of this creature was divine. The Stoic God was the animating force of the cosmos itself, creating, sustaining, unraveling, and regenerating all things. If the atomists were effective atheists then, the Stoics were effective pantheists. This generative and destructive material realm, the world itself, was what they meant by God. Insofar as the world was divine, the Stoics reasoned, it must be perfect. Any seeming flaw or evil was therefore an illusion, the result of our limited vision and poor intellect. This is the earliest understanding of what we've come to think of as a Stoic personality. We can't change our circumstances, the logic goes, so we'd better learn to cope with them. Better yet, to love them. According to one famous dictum, a true Stoic ought to be perfectly happy and free, even when he's being tortured on the rack. We can see then how this Stoic ethic was initially grounded in Stoic cosmology. The reason one should learn to be happy on the rack is that the world, as divine, is perfect down to its last detail. It cannot be otherwise. And what this meant for the Stoic multiverse, remember this ekpyrosis business, was that every time the world was ignited, destroyed, and recreated, it would come back exactly the same. There will be another Plato and another Socrates, Zeno tells us, another Hanover and another Dartmouth, and another Gleiser and another Templeton Foundation, another Philean auditorium in which all of us will again convene under these circular lights trying to figure out the triangular pattern in the... Are you doing this too, trying to figure out the triangular pattern in the carpet? You with your blue shirt, you with your scuffed up shoes, and you just beginning to contemplate the you who will contemplate the you contemplating this you right here, who has traveled to this conference an infinite number of times before to listen to an infinite number of very strange talks, and who will return just like this while unending ages run. World without end. See you next time. So where are we? What we've got are two ancient rival multiverses, one spatial and one temporal, one atheist, one pantheist, one haphazard and one fully rational, but both of them dead set against divinity, understood as a father king who rules the world from beyond it. Perhaps this is the reason neither scenario made it through the long march of Western intellectual and political history. They both called into question the sovereign God who made so much of that imperial history possible. But can you imagine if these schools had survived? As thrilling as the multiverse seems right now, it wouldn't be nearly so surprising, so newsworthy, so awe-inspiring if we'd all spent our childhood in atomist day camps, modeling alternate worlds, or in Stoic temples contemplating the eternal return of the universe. But as it was, most of us grew up learning to love and fear an Oedipal ideal whose legacy is so powerful that whether we believe in him or not, we all agree that he is what we would mean if we were talking about God, which we're not. This disembodied, extra-cosmic God, along with the singular cosmos he created, triumphed over its ancient rivals through the often combined forces of Plato and Aristotle on the one hand and Christian doctrine on the other. Plato took down the atomists in the Timaeus by appealing to a creator God who he insisted made only one universe that would last forever. Are we right then, Timaeus asks, to speak of one universe, or would it be more correct to speak of a plurality or infinity? One is right. Our universe was and is and will continue to be the God's only creation. Aristotle changed the argument, but kept the singular cosmos. And by the time the early Christians came along, the atomists, under the much maligned banner of Epicureanism, had been so thoroughly neglected and misunderstood that they were simply dismissed as hedonists, idiots, and homosexuals. They were so irrelevant, in fact, that St. Augustine didn't even bother to refute atomist cosmology in his City of God. But he spent a ton of time on the Stoics. Okay, so we're about to nerd out on theology for a few minutes. I promise it won't last long, and I promise it's worth it. Augustine's got a creation problem. Here's how it goes. As a Platonist, he believes that God is uncreated and unchanging, like the forms. As a Christian, he believes that the universe is created and changeable. If the universe is created, then it's clearly not eternal. Put simply, the world couldn't have existed before God freely decided to create it. So here's the question. At that time before the universe existed, when there was nothing but God, what was God the God of? How could he have been, say, all-powerful when there was nothing for him to have power over? Or all-knowing when there was nothing outside of himself to know? The easiest solution would be to say with Aristotle that the universe is eternal, so there's always been something in relation to which God is God. But if the universe is eternal, then what's to stop us from likening it to God, or even from identifying it with God? In short, Augustine is in a double bind. He needs God to be both eternal and singular, but securing either of these threatens the other. If God is eternal, then creation should be too, but if creation is eternal, then either there are two gods, God and the universe, or there's just one, and God is the universe, and that would be pantheism, and pantheism is terrible. To get around this dilemma, Augustine's predecessor, Origen of Alexandria, had ironically combined the Stoics with the biblical wisdom tradition. Awesome move. Just as the Stoics taught that the cosmos underwent cycles of death and rebirth, producing another you and another me forever and ever, amen, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. So all Origen did was to replace the pantheist Stoic God with the omnipotent Christian Father, and voila, he solved the eternity problem. If the universe is cyclical, then there has always been a universe for God to be the God of, but any given universe is finite, created, and so clearly not God. Well done. Augustine thinks for a moment. If the universe is cyclical, then there will be another Plato and another Socrates, another blue shirt, two more scuffed up shoes. Souls will be born, will fall, will convert or not, will be saved or not, and then just when they reach heaven or hell, back on the carousel for another go-round. Dear God, thinks Augustine, I hate this idea. It is intolerable for devout ears to hear the opinion expressed that after passing through this life with all its great calamities, that after all these heavy and fearful ills have been expiated and ended by true religion and wisdom, and we've arrived at the sight of God and reached our bliss in the contemplation of immaterial light, that we reach this bliss only to be compelled to abandon it, to be cast down from that eternity, that truth, that felicity, to be involved again in hellish mortality, in shameful stupidity, in detestable miseries where God is lost, where truth is hated, where happiness is sought in unclean wickedness, and to hear that this is to happen again and again, as it has happened before endlessly at periodic intervals, as ages pass in succession, he's not done. Who could listen to this? Who could believe it? Who could even tolerate it? Just a bit more. If it were true, it would be more prudent to suppress the truth, nay, wiser to be in ignorance. I'm trying to find words to express how I feel. Now, I don't know about you, but I've read a lot of Augustine, and I've never seen him this unhinged. God forbid that what they philosophers threaten should be true, he exclaims, before launching into an adorable, if unsatisfying, refutation. Here it is. In his letter to the Romans, says Augustine, St. Paul assures us that Christ died once for all our sins. So this must mean there are no other worlds before or after ours. Otherwise, Christ would have to die one time per world. Crucified here, there, and everywhere. Heaven forbid, says Augustine, not only because a cyclical multiverse would submit his God to perennial violence, but also because it would imply an infinite number of Christs. And Christ, like the God he incarnates, can only be one. Therefore, there is only one world, one God, one world. Enough of this insanity. For all of their differences, then, both the atomists and the Stoics fell historical victims to the sovereign deity of power and might. The history of Western cosmology effectively demonstrates Bernard Carr's dictum in reverse, namely, if you don't want a multiverse, you'd better have God. And so at this point, I begin to wonder whether there's any other way to think about God. And here, I'd like to turn to one last chapter in the long book of cosmic speculation. Our dramatis personae are Nicholas of Cusa, a cardinal of the Catholic Church, and Giordano Bruno, an ex-Dominican polymath now lauded as the father of secular science. Their visions of the universe were nearly identical, apart from one tiny difference, significant enough to install the former as a prince of the church while it incinerated the other as a heretic. He and his multiverse burned at the stake at the dawn of the 17th century. First to Cusa. As far as the 15th century was concerned, this is what the universe looked like. The Earth was at the center, and the sun, moon, and planets rotated in calm circles around it. Beyond them was the sphere of the fixed stars, and beyond that, the realm of God and the saints, a finite creation bounded by its infinite creator. Now, the history of science tells us that this vision of the universe was unrivaled until the mid-16th century, when Copernicus put the sun at the center of the universe. But as you may notice from these diagrams, the heliocentric model and the geocentric model are not quite as different as one might think. Both look sort of like those Russian nesting dolls, and both of them are finite, just with different bodies at the center. A truly radical cosmology came not from Copernicus, who put the sun at the center in 1543, but from the little-known Cardinal of Cusa, who declared 100 years earlier that the universe had no center at all. For Nicholas, being in the universe was like being in the middle of the ocean. Everything is in motion all the time, and so he wrote in a dazzling anticipation of special relativity, "It always appears to every observer, whether on Earth, the sun, or another star, that one is at an immovable center of things, and that all else is being moved. If everything is moving, then nothing is at the center, and if nothing is at the center, then anything might be the center, depending on your point of view. Start from any cosmic body," he suggested, "and the visible area around it is what we call a world." Moreover, Cusa asserted, these worlds must go on forever. The universe must be boundless because by definition, the universe is all that is. How could there be something beyond all that is in order to bind it as finite? Or, as my 11-year-old brother Isaac told me recently, the one thing I know for sure is that the universe is infinite. "You know that for sure?" I said. "Of course I do," said Isaac. "Where would it end?" This is more or less Cusa's argument. Any place at which the universe might be said to end would have to have something on the other side of it to mark it as the end. And of course, if there's another side, then something keeps going, something keeps being beyond any boundary you try to install on what is. The only place Cusa would depart from my little brother on this matter, respectfully, concerns Isaac's use of the word infinite. Granted, the universe is not finite for Cusa, because there are no boundaries within which it could be held. But the universe is not quite infinite either, because as he says, it's not self-caused. God causes the universe, so while the universe is boundless, it's not truly infinite. God is what Cusa calls absolute infinity, whereas creation is a contracted infinity. Now, it may look like these terms are opposed, but this difference between God and the universe is one of relation rather than opposition. What the universe is a created reflection of God. Like God, the universe has no limits. Like God, the universe contains everything that is, as well as the seeds of what will be. As Cusa puts it, it is as if the Creator had spoken, "Let it be made." And because God, who is eternity itself, could not be made, that was made which would be as much like God as possible. The universe is God in the world, God as the world, God unfolded in space and time. So notice what's happening theologically here. Traditionally, Jewish and Christian doctrine has taught that humans are made in the image of God. For Christians, St. Paul goes on to clarify, in case you were wondering, that men are made in the image of God, women are made in the image of men, and then animals, plants, and stones have progressively less God in them as you descend the cosmic hierarchy. Cusa is disrupting the whole system by saying that not man, but the universe bears the image of God. Moreover, where traditional doctrine says that Jesus of Nazareth is God incarnate, Cusa is saying that the world itself is God incarnate. Now, he got into a little bit of trouble for this, the fear of which caused him to tag a whole Christ section onto the end of his cosmology, but the implications are clear. God is not reflected in human beings any more than God is reflected in willow trees or mustard seeds, not present in Jesus, the Son of Mary, any more than in the Crab Nebula or CR27, or Mary for that matter. Rather, God is directly present in and as every part of Cusa's centerless, boundless universe, suffusing its infinite worlds. And at this point, our vision of divinity might start to shift. If humans are not particularly godlike, then God is not particularly humanoid. If the universe is the most genuine reflection of God, then God doesn't look like a guy in the sky. God looks like the universe. This is more or less what Giordano Bruno said a century and a half later, and it got him killed by the Inquisition. We're running out of time, so I'll race through this, but Bruno's fate was the result of three major factors. Historically, he had the misfortune to come along in the wake of the Protestant disaster and the Copernican controversy, so the Roman Catholic Church was feeling, shall we say, on edge. Personally, Bruno seems to have been a pain in the neck, shouting his radical doctrines to anyone who would listen and those who wouldn't, peppering his lectures with crude anatomical jokes, and proclaiming himself the greatest thinker of all time. But the largest factor leading to Bruno's demise was the tiny syntactical tweak he made upon Cusan cosmology. Briefly stated, he deleted the contraction. For Bruno, the universe is not contractedly infinite. It's just infinite, genuinely infinite, both in power and extension. The universe must be infinite for Bruno because its creator is infinite. If in the first efficient cause there be infinite power, he reasons, there must result a universe of infinite size and worlds infinite in number. Anything less, he insisted, would be theologically insulting. Why would an infinitely powerful God create anything less than an infinite universe? What an infinite universe means, however, is that there's no God reserve outside it, no bit of God left over before or beyond creation. For Bruno, the universe is the direct, unmediated, inexhaustible expression of God, and as such, the universe is not only all of God we'll ever know, but all of God there is. In the course of his trial, Bruno made some half-hearted attempts to say that the universe was in some sense different from God, and that sure, Christ was more special than anyone else, but the Inquisition knew what he really meant and destroyed him for it. What he really meant was that this infinite universe, with its infinite worlds, is the source of all things, the life in all things, and the end of all things, or what everybody means by God. This is, in short, pantheism. It's different from Stoic pantheism with its infinite cycles of Socrates, but it's no less threatening to the theological order. In fact, I would suggest that these pantheisms are more theologically threatening even than atheism, precisely because they change what it means for God to be God. Richard Dawkins and American evangelicals may seem to have nothing in common, but they agree completely on what the term God means. It is this father God of theism and atheism that keeps forcing us to see religion and science as cosmic foes, or at best as tragic ex-lovers. But what if science and religion decided they both had better things to do than fight over the non-body of a dead God? Might we then see the multiverse as neither true nor false, as neither disproving the existence of God nor taking his place, but as doing constructive conceptual work, right at the shoreline where physics meets metaphysics? What old and new gods, what creative and destructive forces can we glimpse in the cosmic forces of gravity, dark energy, strings, and the Schrödinger equation? How might we read such scientific productions in their historical, conceptual, and even mythological contexts? And what might these contexts tell us about what it is we keep wanting from science? In short, rather than heading to science to ask whether it confirms or disproves religion, I'm hoping to read each of them the way we tend to read the other, to unearth and even celebrate the rowdy disciplinary entanglements that drew so many of us into these big idea fields in the first place. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Jane. That was awesome. I'm sure there'll be questions, Alan.
Thank you for a very interesting historical talk. You said near the end that we should, and this is part of your ethos of bringing science and religion together, that we should perhaps view the multiverse as neither true nor false. Mm-hmm. But that's a very different statement than saying that that science cannot determine the truth or falsity of the multiverse. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very critical difference. Mm-hmm. I don't think that any scientist could say that the multiverse idea is neither true nor false. Mm-hmm. I think there are many scientists who would say that it's outside of the ability of science to prove it one way or the other.
Yeah, thanks. Let me see if this is a direction that's fun to go in. Internally to cosmology, for example, to physical cosmology, I'm not sure that it's possible to dispense with the question of whether or not there is a multiverse, right? That's going to be an animating question. And the major criterion by which that will have to be determined and what kind of multiverse it is going to depend upon what counts as evidence for a multiverse. Right. So will it be admitted that particular splotches on the CMB can count for evidence of other worlds colliding with this one, or early ancient black holes, and so that's going to be a dispute over evidence that I think it will be sort of fun for those of us who are outside physical cosmology to see. How much of this are you willing to admit, and how much are you willing not? And it seems to me that different scientists are going to jump off the multiverse bus at different points, depending on what counts as evidence or not. I think what I was saying about the just bracketing the question of whether it's true or false was primarily aimed at a kind of interdisciplinary context. I don't think that it does a lot of good to bring philosophers and religionists and scientists into a room together and say, like, okay, now figure it out. Is there a multiverse or not? I just don't think that it's a conversation that's going to be interesting, even if it does happen, and it's certainly not going to produce much of anything. But what humanists and scientists can do is say, like, why do we want a multiverse? Like, why all of a sudden in the early 2000s did the multiverse, which had been, there had been in the late 60s, the many worlds interpretation, in the 80s, chaotic inflation, eternal chaotic inflation, like these ideas had been around. Like, why suddenly in the early 2000s, after the discovery of dark energy, was there like a critical mass of physicists who were like, all right, at least we'll think about it, right? What do we want from this idea? Why do we take it seriously now, even as a possibility, even as a hypothesis? And where has this idea been before? Where have we seen it in the past? Where is it? Yeah. I think absolutely. I think so, because I think that dark energy was the most recent and most shocking. It was a discovery of a fine tuning to come along in a long time, and it was a universal fine tuning. It wasn't just like life on this planet wouldn't be possible. It was that if the cosmological constant were any stronger, we wouldn't have a universe at all, and this is a big problem. So it puts pressure on the fine tuning argument. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm just really curious. I don't know very much about this, but it just struck me. You said what would count as evidence for the multiverse, and it seemed to me that it's got to be a philosophical question, because we're in one universe of the multiverse, right? So we couldn't have evidence from other universes. Right.
And a lot of this depends upon the definition also of universe. So the astronomer royal, Martin Rees, says, look, okay, technically the word universe means, it means everything turned into one. It doesn't, but it connotes technically all that is, he says, right? So if it turns out that there's broad consensus that there is a multiverse, which is to say that there are other regions of space-time beyond our Big Bang event, If it turns out that that's the case, then we would have to use the term universe actually for all of that instead, and we'd have to ditch the term multiverse. But at the moment, he says, we're using it as a kind of placeholder. And at the moment, we'll just say that the universe is the one that we're in, that we can see, that we can... In terms of evidence of other universes, right. The only possibility that there might be evidence of other universes, meaning space-time compendiums arising from Big Bang events, the only possibility that there might be evidence of other ones here would be that they would have left some imprint in some way on our cosmic microwave background. Right? So they have to be in some way connected to ours, in some like weird, remote, mediate, entangled way connected to ours, in order to have any kind of evidence that they exist at all. If what we're talking about is utterly, totally unconnected regions of space-time, then yes, in principle, there will never be any kind of evidence. But there are a number of physicists working in very different contexts with really different models of the multiverse who are like, look, I wish I had a picture of the CMB. It's like this, it's like an oval that has, it has temperature and density variations. It's a measurement of temperature and density variations. It's like a snapshot of the universe 380,000 years after it was born. And a number of physicists theoretical physicists will look at this and say like, oh, wait, right here, it's like reading tea leaves. Like there, right there, you can see evidence of other universes that were born from the same multiversal soup that we were born from. And others are like, that's insane. No, it's evidence of different universes coming out of different kind of ways of like black holes and things like that. So this is what I mean by a dispute over what counts as evidence. And then others are like, that is space dust, you idiots. That has nothing to do with, right? It's not universes.
But in all fairness, if what these guys are saying is that if we do have a multiverse, there is a finite probability that during the existence of this universe, there was not a very violent collision with another universe. Think of soap bubbles colliding, but a grazing interaction. And that grazing interaction would have perturbed the gravitational interactions within our universe, and that would have left an imprint on this radiation that is around us, which has a ring-like shape, which is very hard to explain in any other way that we can think of.
Right. But again, Penrose looks at those rings, and he's like, that's my universe. And others who are not Penrose look at those rings, and they're like, no, that's my universe.
The problem is precisely that one, is that you cannot say that this sort of ring-like structure is unique to this particular phenomenon. And so, exactly.
Right. Another bit, and this is David Hume, right?
Thank you for a rousing talk. That is the highest compliment I can give. So I was just recently at a conference with Lee Smolin and Roberto Unger, who completely reject the multiverse and have a very different kind of metaphysics that they're arguing for. And that's what much of this conference was, about arguing about the metaphysics. So what I wonder is, from your perspective, there in this debate or this discussion between science and religion and the different path you're finding about their dialogue, this must also need to be included, the singular universe. If there is only one universe, and don't you also still want to remove this fake debate that we have and possibly find? So I'm wondering what if
wait, remove the fake debate. Which fake debate?
The general fake debate, or not fake? It's not really fake, but the opposition of science and religion, right? The way in which culture has pushed them into different domains. How might one imagine if the multiverse gets abandoned 5 years from now and we're back to the singular universe or singular universe? How might the same process work?
Well, so first of all, and I'm sorry if this strays from your question, I don't think that Smolin abandons the multiverse at all. He abandons the inflationary multiverse. He says but he gives us an infinite number, or at least endless, number of universes created inside black holes. That's totally a multiverse.
Well,
it's just that he...
This is his newer stuff, which is really, right, there's
but
only one-time history.
But his newer stuff is still saying that the fundamental laws of the universe are sort of like tested out time and time again, right? Yeah, it's just that he, and maybe we can, but he, I don't, at least in his, no, they're not separate space-times, but it's still this vast plurality of universes, and when what he's doing is making it all internal to what he's calling the universe. I mean, he's doing the work that Rees is calling cosmologists to do and to figure out like what's one explanatory principle that could account for all of these compendia of whatever, and then let's just call that thing the universe. I think it's basically polemically that he's refusing to use the term multiverse, which is totally fine because it gets, but so I don't know. I find his cosmology no less wacko than anybody else's. It's just that he's got what he's got is, and I mean he does precisely what Krauss and Hawking say they're doing, but which they're actually not, which is to say he's applying the laws of natural selection to the universe itself, right? And he's and saying, you know, we can explain the constants as not finely tuned, but rather as evolving by natural selection. He too is giving us immanent processes that account for the emergence of the physical universe. I think it's a false start if we ask, so suppose we like Smolin's model and we say like, okay, I think it's a false start to ask, is that thing compatible with God or not, right? Because it's always compatible with God. I mean, that's the thing about the sticking power of this weird idea. It's always compatible with that sort of external father creator. Everything is. But it's not, it doesn't particularly prove or disprove or give evidence for or against. It's just that you can always stick a God-shaped hat onto that cosmology.
Well, one of these alternatives, just like you're saying that the Stoics offered a very different way of
sure.
perceiving,
Smolin could decide that this internal process of evolution and of like, frankly, reproductive proliferation of universes is what divinity has been trying to mean conceptually for a long time. He could say that if he wanted to, right? And that would be interesting. Then you could say like, all right, what does your God look like, Smolin? And he could be like, well, my God is kind of cool. My God makes babies out of its umbilical cords. Like that's right. The problem is that we're stuck on this notion that all God can mean. Is this right? So that's
So just to be an intellectual anarchist, I have to say that last year I published a paper that makes the Stoic Phoenix-like multiverse in time a possibility as well.
Right.
You know, you can tweak the equations of cosmology and violate a couple of laws that people love to make that happen.
Right. Well, and Stein
and I did it just for fun, just to show, look, you guys are talking about multiverse in space. Look, you can do it in time too.
Well,
you know,
and Paul Steinhardt still does that, and he still does it very earnestly. And he actually calls his universe ekpyrotic because he's drawing on the Stoics. So there are those as well.
So just since you mentioned Lee Smolin, I a few years ago I was having dinner at the Perimeter Institute, and I was seated between Lee on one side and Lenny Susskind on the other side. And I got to get them to see if they could both agree that they advocated a multiverse and that their works were not too different from each other. But I won't tell you what happened then. Let's say it wasn't pretty. But I just a few years ago, I pointed this William James quote to Max Tegmark, and I just thought I'd bring it back up because it's important. You know, William James, he brought this up in the context of a theological argument about, he's talking about Leibniz and how we would no longer agree with Leibniz. But it's such a great quote, I just have to share it with you. He says, "Visible nature is all plasticity and indifference, a moral multiverse, as one might call it, not a moral universe. To such a harlot we owe no allegiance." So not only does he call nature a multiverse, he calls it a harlot.
Yes, he does call her a harlot, and this is in his. So that's from his early essay, "The Will to Believe," and that's where he coins the frame. Oh, is life worth living? Sorry, is life worth living? Right, which is an address he gives to Harvard Divinity School, actually. And he coins it there. Yep.
So before everybody leaves, just to let you know, tomorrow we start again at 9:15, and Dartmouth's president, Phil Hanlon, is going to welcome us here, and then we go on for most of the day. I think we have to stop now, people. We've been doing this for a long time. Thank you all for coming. Bye.